Marcus Thornfield stood at the mahogany bar of his Chicago penthouse, crystal tumbler trembling in his manicured hand. Outside, the city sparkled with electric lights his railroad empire had helped power. Inside, the weight of a single telegram crushed down on his chest like a freight train. 3 words that would change everything. She said no. The farmer's daughter had just done something no one in 40 years had dared to do. She had refused. Augustus Thornfield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been born into luxury on a Tuesday morning in October 1885, delivered by the finest physician in Chicago, while his father Augustus closed a deal to purchase 300 miles of struggling track in Oklahoma. The doctor's fee was paid in railroad bonds. Even Marcus's first breath was a business transaction. The Thornfield mansion occupied an entire city block on the Gold Coast, its limestone facade gleaming like a fortress against Lake Michigan's gray waters. Inside, Persian rugs covered floors of imported Italian marble, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors watched over rooms that echoed with the absence of laughter. Marcus learned to walk on those cold floors, his small feet slipping on surfaces too polished for childhood. Augustus Thornfield ruled this empire with the precision of a station master and the ruthlessness of a locomotive plowing through snow. He had built the Midwest Continental Railroad from nothing, transforming a single freight line into a network that stretched from Chicago to Denver, from Minneapolis to New Orleans. His trains carried grain from Kansas wheat fields, cattle from Texas ranches, and steel from Pittsburgh mills. They also carried his reputation, brilliant, relentless, and utterly without mercy for those who stood in his way. Marcus grew up in the shadow of that reputation, measured against ledgers and profit margins before he could properly hold a pencil. At age 8, he was expected to recite railroad schedules at dinner parties. At 12, he accompanied his father to board meetings, sitting silent in the corner, while men twice his age deferred to Augustus's every word. At 16, he was apprenticed to the company's head engineer, learning the mechanical heartbeat of the empire he would someday inherit. But Marcus was not his father, and this difference revealed itself in ways both subtle and profound. Where Augustus saw obstacles to be crushed, Marcus saw people to be considered. Where his father calculated profit margins, Marcus wondered about the families displaced by new tracks, the small towns that withered when the railroad chose alternate routes. The breaking point had come 3 summers ago, during the expansion through the Missouri River valleys. Augustus had ordered the construction crews to build straight through a small German settlement called Hoffnung, rather than around it, as the original surveys suggested. The reroute would save the company $30,000 and 3 weeks of construction time. It would also destroy a community that had existed for 60 years. Marcus had been 21 then, fresh from his engineering degree at Northwestern, eager to prove himself worthy of the Thornfield name. He had argued for the alternate route, presenting detailed cost analyses and construction timelines that showed the savings were minimal compared to the human cost. Augustus had listened with the patience of a man indulging a child's tantrum, then proceeded with the original plan. The demolition began on a Monday morning. Marcus stood on a hillside overlooking Hoffnung, watching steam shovels tear through the small white church where 3 generations of families had been baptized and married and mourned. The general store where children had pressed their faces against candy jars crumbled under the weight of progress. By Wednesday, nothing remained but rubble and the ghosts of a community that had committed no crime except existing in the path of Thornfield ambition. The residents were compensated. Of course, Augustus was not entirely heartless, merely practical. But money could not rebuild the bonds between neighbors, could not restore the graves that had been relocated to distant cemeteries, could not heal the bitter divisions that arose when some families accepted the railroad's offers while others held out for justice that never came. Marcus had returned to Chicago that weekend carrying something new in his chest, a cold, hard weight that settled behind his ribs and never quite left. He began to understand that his inheritance came with a price that extended far beyond the mansion and the money. Every mile of track, every station, every freight car bore the invisible stains of compromise and calculation. He tried to find solace in the technical aspects of the business. The Thornfield workshops were marvels of engineering, where skilled craftsmen built locomotives that were faster, stronger, and more efficient than anything their competitors could produce. Marcus threw himself into design problems, spending long hours in the machine shops, his hands black with grease, his mind focused on the clean mathematics of pistons and boilers and steel. But even this sanctuary was tainted. The workshops employed over 2,000 men, many of them immigrants from Ireland and Eastern Europe, who worked 12-hour shifts for wages that barely supported their families. Marcus had proposed better working conditions, improved safety measures, shorter hours. Augustus had rejected each suggestion with the same calm logic. Their competitors would gain advantage, costs would rise, profits would fall. The railroad was not a charity, he reminded his son. It was a business. The hypocrisy ate at Marcus like acid. He lived in a mansion built on the labor of men who returned each night to overcrowded tenements. He ate meals prepared by servants, who earned less in a year than he spent on a single suit. He attended charity galas where Chicago's elite donated pocket change to causes that would never address the systematic inequalities their own businesses perpetuated. The worst part was how natural it all seemed to everyone else. His friends from Northwestern, the sons of other industrial families, moved through this world with easy confidence, secure in their right to comfort and power. They spoke of progress and civilization, of bringing order to the chaos of the frontier, of the natural hierarchy that placed men like them at the top of society's ladder. Marcus wanted to believe in that vision. It would have been so much easier to accept his inheritance. Without question, to assume that wealth and privilege were rewards for virtue rather than accidents of birth. But the weight in his chest grew heavier with each passing month, fed by small moments of recognition. The way servants averted their eyes when he passed, the careful deference in voices that spoke to him, the invisible barriers that separated his world from the world of ordinary people. He began to drink, not heavily, but steadily. A glass of bourbon with breakfast, wine with lunch, whiskey in the evening. The alcohol softened the edges of his discomfort, made the contradictions of his life seem less sharp. It also made him more observant, paradoxically, as if the loosening of his inhibitions allowed him to see truths that sobriety had hidden. He noticed how his father's business associates spoke differently when they thought no one was listening. How they laughed about the rubes and yokels, whose land they acquired through legal maneuvering and political influence. How they discussed workers as if they were components in a machine, replaceable parts to be used efficiently and discarded when they broke down. The drinking worried Augustus, not out of paternal concern, but because it represented a lack of control, a weakness that could be exploited by business rivals. He arranged for Marcus to spend time with Dr. Harrison Webb, a family friend who specialized in treating the nervous disorders that seemed to afflict the sons of wealthy families with increasing frequency. Dr. Webb's office occupied the top floor of a building owned by the Thornfield Corporation, its windows offering a commanding view of the rail yards that sprawled along the Chicago River. The doctor was a thin, precise man who spoke in measured tones and took extensive notes in a leather-bound journal. He prescribed tonics for Marcus's nerves, exercises for his constitution, and a regimen of cold baths and vigorous activity designed to restore mental clarity. But Marcus's problem was not medical. It was moral. He was trapped in a life that demanded he become someone he did not want to be, inheriting not just wealth, but the accumulated guilt of everyone who had suffered to create that wealth. The railroad empire was built on displacement and exploitation, on the systematic destruction of communities and ways of life that had existed for generations. The irony was not lost on him that the very tracks that brought prosperity to some brought ruin to others. The trains that carried goods to market also carried away the independence of small farmers, forcing them to sell their crops at prices dictated by railroad monopolies. The stations that connected distant cities also served as beachheads for economic colonization, allowing Chicago merchants to undercut local businesses and drain wealth from rural communities. Marcus understood the mathematics of this system with crystalline clarity. He had studied the reports, analyzed the profit margins, traced the flow of money from the periphery to the center. He knew that every dollar of Thornfield wealth represented multiple dollars extracted from the farmers, ranchers, and small-town merchants who depended on the railroad for access to markets. This knowledge should have motivated him to change the system from within, to use his privileged position to advocate for reform. Instead, it paralyzed him. The system was too large, too entrenched, too profitable to be altered by the conscience of a single man. Augustus had spent 40 years building this empire, and he would not allow his son's moral qualms to threaten its foundation. The final confirmation of Marcus's powerlessness came during a board meeting in late 1908. A group of Kansas farmers had organized a cooperative to negotiate better shipping rates, arguing that the railroad's monopoly position allowed it to charge prices that made farming barely profitable. They had retained a lawyer, filed complaints with state regulators, and threatened to build their own spur line to connect with a competing railroad. Augustus had dealt with such challenges before. He called in political favors, delayed regulatory hearings, and used the railroad's economic influence to pressure the farmers' creditors and suppliers. Within 6 months, the cooperative collapsed, its leaders bankrupted by legal fees and lost business. The farmers returned to shipping their grain at the old rates, their brief rebellion crushed by the weight of systemic power. Marcus had watched this destruction with growing horror, seeing in it a preview of his own future. This was what he would inherit, not just tracks and trains and stations, but the machinery of exploitation, the systematic extraction of wealth from those who could not defend themselves. He would become the instrument of other people's ruin, the face of a system that treated human beings as expendable resources. The realization drove him deeper into himself, into a world of books and solitary walks along the lakefront, away from the mansion and the offices and the constant pressure to become what he was expected to become. He read philosophy and poetry, searching for some framework that would make sense of his situation. He found temporary solace in the writings of men who had grappled with similar contradictions, but their wisdom seemed distant and abstract when measured against the concrete realities of his inheritance. Augustus watched his son's withdrawal with growing impatience. Marcus was 24 now, old enough to take on greater responsibilities within the company, old enough to marry and produce heirs to continue the Thornfield legacy. But instead of embracing his destiny, he seemed to be retreating from it, becoming more introspective and less decisive with each passing month. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The old man had built his empire through decisive action, through the willingness to make hard choices and accept their consequences. He had no patience for the moral complexities that seemed to paralyze his son. Business was business, and sentiment was a luxury that successful men could not afford. It was time, Augustus decided, to force the issue. Marcus needed to be confronted with a choice that would clarify his priorities and cement his commitment to the family business. He needed to be given a task that would require him to act like a Thornfield, to prove that he could put practical considerations ahead of abstract principles. The solution came to him during a review of the company's expansion plans. The railroad needed to extend its network into the fertile valleys of southern Illinois, where German and Irish immigrants had established prosperous farming communities. The land was perfect for agriculture, which meant it was perfect for generating freight revenue. But the farmers who owned that land were independent-minded and suspicious of outside interference. They would not sell easily, and they would not be intimidated by lawyers or bought off with token payments. What they might respect, however, was a gesture of good faith from the railroad company, a sign that the Thornfield Corporation understood the importance of family and community, that it was willing to become part of the local fabric rather than simply exploiting it from a distance. Augustus smiled as the plan took shape in his mind. It was elegant in its simplicity, practical in its implementation, and it would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. Marcus would be forced to demonstrate his commitment to the family business. The railroad would gain access to valuable agricultural land, and the farmers would be given a stake in the company's success. All it would require was a marriage. The proposal came on a Tuesday morning in February 1909, delivered with the same casual precision Augustus used to discuss quarterly earnings. Marcus had been summoned to his father's office in the Thornfield Building, a 20-story monument to railroad prosperity that dominated Chicago's financial district. The mahogany-paneled room occupied the entire top floor, its windows offering a panoramic view of the rail yards that stretched like steel veins across the city. Augustus sat behind his massive desk, studying a map of southern Illinois that had been marked with red ink to indicate property boundaries and population centers. He did not look up when Marcus entered, instead continuing to trace railway routes with his finger while speaking in the measured tones of a man accustomed to absolute authority. "The Richland Valley," he said, tapping the map with a gold-tipped pen. 30,000 acres of the finest farmland in the state. Corn, wheat, soybeans, cattle. The soil is so rich you could grow money in it, and the farmers there are prosperous enough to ship year-round. A branch line through that valley would generate more freight revenue than any expansion we've undertaken. Marcus approached the desk cautiously, recognizing the tone in his father's voice. It was the same calculated calm that had preceded the destruction of Hoffnung, the same deliberate patience that masked ruthless determination. "What's the obstacle?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The farmers won't sell." Augustus finally looked up, his gray eyes sharp with intelligence and something that might have been amusement. "They're organized, suspicious, and they've been burned before by railroad promises. 3 companies have tried to buy right-of-way through the valley in the past 5 years. Each time, the farmers have refused to negotiate." Marcus studied the map, noting the way the existing rail lines curved around the valley like water flowing around a stone. The detour added nearly 60 miles to the route between Chicago and St. Louis. 60 miles of additional track maintenance, fuel costs, and travel time. A direct line through the valley would eliminate that inefficiency while opening access to some of the most productive agricultural land in the Midwest. "Have you considered offering them better terms?" Marcus asked. "Higher prices, guaranteed shipping rates, perhaps partial ownership in the branch line." Augustus smiled, the expression carrying no warmth. "Of course. We've offered them everything except what they actually want, which is to be left alone. These are people who came west to escape the industrial cities, who built their communities from nothing, who distrust anything that smells of corporate manipulation. They see railroads as threats to their independence, not opportunities for prosperity." The old man rose from his chair and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the city he had helped build. "But they're not unreasonable people. They understand the value of family, of community bonds, of traditional relationships. They might be willing to deal with a railroad company that demonstrated genuine respect for their values." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. His father was building toward something, laying groundwork for a proposal that would change everything. What kind of demonstration? Marriage? Augustus turned back to face his son, his expression neutral, as if he were discussing the weather. The key to the entire valley is the Mueller farm. Heinrich Mueller owns the largest tract of land, and he's the unofficial leader of the farming community. His word carries weight with the other landowners. If he endorses our expansion plans, the rest will follow. The name struck Marcus like a physical blow. He had heard of Heinrich Mueller, the German immigrant who had transformed a wilderness homestead into one of the most productive farms in Illinois. The man was legendary for his integrity, his agricultural innovations, and his fierce independence. He was also known for his protective devotion to his family, particularly his daughter. Mueller has a daughter, Augustus continued, his voice carrying the same casual tone he might use to discuss livestock prices. Charlotte Mueller, 22 years old, educated at the local seminary, skilled in household management and agricultural planning. By all accounts, she's intelligent, capable, and devoted to her family's interests. Marcus stared at his father, understanding flooding through him like ice water. You want me to marry her? I want you to court her, win her affection, and convince her family that a marriage alliance would benefit both the Mueller farm and the Thornfield Corporation. Once you're married, Heinrich will have a personal stake in our success. He'll want to ensure his daughter's security, which means ensuring the railroad's prosperity. The proposal was breathtaking in its cynicism. Augustus was asking his son to manipulate an innocent woman's emotions, to exploit her family's trust, to use the sacred bonds of marriage as a tool for corporate expansion. It was the kind of calculated cruelty that had built the railroad empire, dressed up in the language of romance and family values. I won't do it, Marcus said quietly. Augustus raised an eyebrow. Won't do what? Court a young woman? Marry into a respectable family? Take on the responsibilities of a husband and eventually a father? These are normal expectations for a man in your position. Won't lie to her. Won't pretend to love her just to steal her father's land. Who says anything about pretending? Augustus returned to his desk, settling back into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had anticipated every objection. Charlotte Mueller is by all accounts a remarkable young woman, intelligent, beautiful, accomplished. Many men would consider themselves fortunate to win her hand. Perhaps you'll discover that your feelings are genuine. The logic was seductive and poisonous. Augustus was offering his son a way to rationalize the deception, to tell himself that he was merely being introduced to a suitable bride through unconventional means. But Marcus could see through the manipulation, could recognize the trap being laid with such careful precision. And if I refuse, then you'll have demonstrated that you're not ready for the responsibilities of leading this company. Augustus opened a leather folder and withdrew a stack of documents. I've been reviewing the succession plans, considering whether you have the fortitude to make difficult decisions in the company's interest. This situation will provide an excellent test of your character. The threat was implicit but clear. Marcus's inheritance, his position in the company, his entire future depended on his willingness to participate in this scheme. Augustus had structured the choice to eliminate alternatives, to force his son into a corner where compliance was the only rational option. The Mueller farm is struggling, Augustus continued, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer explaining a complex problem. The previous 2 harvests have been poor, and Heinrich has borrowed heavily to maintain his operations. The local bank is owned by our associates, and they're prepared to call in his loans unless he can demonstrate improved prospects for repayment. Marcus felt sick. His father had orchestrated the entire situation, using financial pressure to make the Mueller family vulnerable to his proposal. The marriage would not be a romantic courtship, but a rescue operation, with Charlotte Mueller as the price for her family's survival. She know, Marcus said desperately. She see through the deception. Will she? Augustus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his chest. You're an attractive young man from a prominent family. You've been educated at the finest schools. You understand business and engineering. You can offer her a life of comfort and security. Many women would find such a proposal appealing, especially if their family's welfare depended on it. The calculation was perfect and horrible. Augustus had identified the precise pressure points that would make his scheme irresistible to the Mueller family. They would see the marriage as salvation, not manipulation. Charlotte would be encouraged by her parents to accept the proposal, told that it was her duty to secure her family's future. Besides, Augustus added, you'll be living on the farm, at least initially. You'll learn agricultural management, understand the business from the ground up. It will be valuable experience for your future role in the company. And if you discover that you genuinely care for the young woman, so much the better. The plan was comprehensive and ruthless. Marcus would be embedded in the farming community, presented as a reformed city man seeking to understand rural life. He would court Charlotte with apparent sincerity, win her family's trust, and gradually introduce the idea of railroad expansion as a mutual benefit. By the time the true scope of the scheme became clear, it would be too late to reverse the damage. I need time to consider this, Marcus said, though he already knew he had no real choice. Of course, Augustus returned the documents to their folder. But don't take too long. The farming season begins in a few weeks, and we need to establish your presence in the community before then. I've already arranged for you to visit the valley next month, ostensibly to study agricultural techniques for potential railroad freight optimization. Even the cover story had been prepared, complete with plausible explanations for Marcus's sudden interest in farming. Augustus had thought of everything, anticipated every objection, prepared responses for every possible complication. The machinery of manipulation was already in motion, waiting only for Marcus's reluctant participation. There's one more thing, Augustus said as Marcus turned to leave. Charlotte Mueller is not some naive country girl. She's been educated, exposed to literature and philosophy, trained to think critically about the world around her. She'll be suspicious of any man who seems too eager to win her affection, especially a man from the city. Your courtship will need to be subtle, patient, and above all, authentic. The final twist was the cruelest of all. Augustus was warning his son that success would require him to actually become the kind of man Charlotte Mueller might genuinely love. He would need to discover and develop the better angels of his nature, to show her kindness and consideration and respect, even while knowing that his ultimate purpose was to betray her trust. Marcus left his father's office carrying a leather portfolio containing detailed information about the Mueller family, maps of their property, and background reports on the farming community. He spent the rest of the day in his apartment, studying the materials like a general preparing for battle. Charlotte Mueller's photograph showed a young woman with intelligent eyes and a serious expression, her dark hair pulled back in a practical style that suggested someone more concerned with substance than fashion. She had graduated from the Carlinville Seminary with honors, spoke German and French in addition to English, and was known throughout the valley for her innovative approaches to crop rotation and livestock management. Her father, Heinrich, was 58 years old, a widower who had immigrated from Bavaria in 1875 with nothing but determination and a basic understanding of agricultural principles. He had built his farm through backbreaking labor and careful planning, gradually expanding his holdings until he owned nearly 2,000 acres of prime farmland. His reputation for integrity was legendary, and his word was considered more reliable than any legal contract. The financial reports painted a different picture. Heinrich had borrowed heavily to purchase additional land and improve his operations, betting that increased production would generate sufficient revenue to service his debts. But crop failures in 1907 and 1908 had reduced his income while leaving his expenses unchanged. The loans would come due in the fall of 1909, and without a dramatic improvement in his circumstances, He would be forced to sell portions of his land to meet his obligations. Marcus could see his father's hand in these difficulties. The bank that held Heinrich's loans was controlled by Thornfield Associates, and the terms had been structured to create exactly this kind of pressure. Augustus had been planning this scheme for months, perhaps years, slowly tightening the financial noose until the Mueller family would be grateful for any offer of assistance. The psychological profiles were the most disturbing part of the portfolio. They described Charlotte as independent-minded but devoted to her family, suspicious of outsiders but capable of deep loyalty once her trust was earned. She had rejected several suitors from the local farming community, apparently because she felt they lacked the intellectual curiosity and broader perspective she valued. This information suggested that she might be attracted to a man from the city, someone who could offer her exposure to literature, art, and philosophical ideas that were unavailable in the farming community. But she would also be wary of anyone who seemed to look down on rural life, or who appeared to be slumming among the farmers for entertainment. Marcus closed the portfolio and poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands shaking slightly as he contemplated the magnitude of what his father was asking him to do. He was being asked to study another human being like a specimen, to identify her vulnerabilities and exploit them for corporate gain. It was a form of emotional warfare, disguised as romance but serving the same ruthless purposes as any other business strategy. The worst part was that he could see how it might work. Augustus had chosen his target carefully, identifying a woman who might genuinely be compatible with his son, whose interests and values might align with Marcus's own better nature. The deception would be most effective if it contained elements of truth. If Marcus could discover authentic reasons to care for Charlotte Mueller, even while pursuing his ulterior motives. The telephone rang, interrupting his brooding. It was Dr. Webb, checking on his patient's progress and suggesting that a change of scenery might be beneficial for his nervous condition. The doctor had been briefed on the plan, Marcus realized. Even his therapeutic treatment was being coordinated to support the scheme. "I understand you're considering a visit to the countryside," Dr. Webb said in his precisely modulated voice. "Fresh air, physical activity, and distance from urban pressures can be remarkably restorative for men in your situation. I would strongly recommend an extended stay, perhaps several months, to allow for complete recovery." The medical recommendation would provide perfect cover for Marcus's extended presence in the farming community. He would be presented as a young man recovering from nervous exhaustion, seeking the therapeutic benefits of rural life. The story would explain his unfamiliarity with farming, his need for guidance and instruction, and his gradual integration into the community. Augustus had orchestrated every detail, anticipated every question, prepared explanations for every aspect of the deception. The plan was a masterpiece of manipulation, comprehensive and subtle, and virtually foolproof. It would work because it was designed to give everyone involved what they thought they wanted, while serving the railroad's interests above all else. Marcus finished his whiskey and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that sparkled like stars in the darkness. Somewhere to the south, Charlotte Mueller was probably preparing for bed, unaware that her future was being decided by men she had never met, for reasons she could not imagine. He thought about the photograph in the portfolio, the intelligent eyes and serious expression, the face of a woman who deserved better than to be used as a pawn in someone else's game. But he also thought about his own future, his inheritance, his position in the company that had been his whole life since childhood. The trap was closing around him, and he could see no way to escape without destroying everything he had been raised to value. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for his journey to the Richland Valley, where he would meet Charlotte Mueller and begin the most important performance of his life. The train pulled into Carlinville Station on a crisp March morning. In 1909, its whistle echoing across the flat Illinois prairie like a challenge to the rural quiet. Marcus stepped onto the wooden platform carrying a single leather suitcase and wearing clothes deliberately chosen to suggest a city man's awkward attempt at rural practicality. His boots were too clean, his work shirt too perfectly pressed, his wool coat too expensive for genuine farm work. The act began immediately. He stumbled slightly on the platform steps, caught himself with visible embarrassment, and looked around with the wide-eyed uncertainty of someone genuinely lost. The performance was necessary because Augustus had warned him that the farming community would be watching from the moment he arrived, measuring his every gesture for signs of condescension or deception. A weathered man in overalls approached, with the cautious friendliness of someone greeting a potentially dangerous stranger. "You'd be the Thornfield boy," he said, not making it a question. "I'm Thomas Brennan. Heinrich asked me to meet you." Marcus extended his hand, noting the man's calloused grip and the way his eyes searched for signs of character weakness. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Brennan. I hope my presence won't be too much of an imposition." "Heinrich doesn't consider helping a neighbor an imposition," Brennan replied, loading Marcus's suitcase onto a wagon that had seen better decades. "Though I'll warn you, farm work isn't what most city folks expect. It's honest labor, but it's hard on the body and harder on the spirit if you're not built for it." The wagon ride through the Richland Valley was a revelation. Marcus had studied maps and agricultural reports, but the reality was more beautiful and more complex than any document could convey. The fields stretched toward the horizon in geometric patterns of brown earth and green shoots, broken by windbreaks of oak and maple trees that followed the natural contours of the land. Farmhouses dotted the landscape like islands, each surrounded by barns, silos, and outbuildings that spoke of generations of accumulated wisdom about living from the soil. "That's the Mueller place," Brennan said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings that rose from the prairie like a small city. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built of local limestone, its wide porch and tall windows suggesting prosperity without ostentation. The barn was even more impressive, a cathedral of wood and iron that could shelter livestock and store grain for the entire community. Marcus felt a stab of guilt as he studied the property. Everything he saw represented decades of backbreaking labor, careful planning, and the kind of deep commitment to place that his own family had never understood. Heinrich Mueller had built something beautiful and sustainable, something that would endure long after the railroad tracks were torn up and forgotten. "Heinrich's been expecting you," Brennan continued. "He's curious about your ideas for improving freight efficiency. Most of us figured the railroad companies already had that sorted out, but he says there's always room for learning." The cover story was working perfectly. Marcus was being presented as a young railroad executive studying agricultural production to optimize shipping schedules and freight car utilization. It was plausible enough to explain his presence, while sophisticated enough to suggest he might have valuable insights to offer. The Mueller farmhouse was surrounded by a white picket fence that enclosed a garden showing the first signs of spring preparation. Marcus could see someone moving among the raised beds, but the figure was too distant to identify. His heart began to race as he realized that he was about to meet Charlotte Mueller, the woman whose life he was being asked to manipulate for corporate. Jane. Heinrich Mueller emerged from the barn before they reached the house, wiping his hands on a cloth and studying Marcus with the frank appraisal of a man who judged people by their actions rather than their words. He was shorter than Marcus had expected, but his presence filled the space around him with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to responsibility. "Mr. Thornfield," Heinrich said, his accent barely noticeable after 30 years in America. "Welcome to our farm. I hope your journey was comfortable." "Very comfortable, thank you," Marcus replied, climbing down from the wagon with more grace than he had shown at the station. "I'm grateful for your willingness to host me, Mr. Mueller. I know my presence represents an additional burden during your busy season." Heinrich's expression showed approval at the acknowledgement. "Learning is never a burden, young man. If you can help us understand how to work more efficiently with the railroad companies, we all benefit. And if we can teach you something about farming in the process, even better." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young woman from the garden. She walked with the confident stride of someone comfortable in her own domain. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her simple dress practical rather than fashionable. Marcus recognized her immediately from the photograph, but the image had not captured the intelligence in her eyes or the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Charlotte," Heinrich said, "this is Marcus Thornfield, the young man from Chicago. I told you about Mr. Thornfield, my daughter Charlotte." She offered her hand with a firm grip and a direct gaze that seemed to look right through his carefully constructed facade. "Mr. Thornfield, I hope you'll find our rural methods educational, even if they're not as sophisticated as what you're accustomed to in the city." The words were polite, but Marcus detected a subtle challenge in her tone. She was testing him, trying to determine whether he was another condescending urbanite who viewed farming as a quaint anachronism. His response would set the tone for everything that followed. "I suspect I'll be the student rather than the teacher, Miss Mueller," he said carefully. "I've studied agricultural production from a theoretical perspective, but I have little practical experience with the daily realities of farm management." She nodded thoughtfully, as if filing away his response for future consideration. "Theory has its place, but the soil doesn't read textbooks. We'll see how quickly you adapt to learning with your hands instead of your head." The challenge was unmistakable now, delivered with a slight smile that suggested she was enjoying his discomfort. Marcus realized that Charlotte Mueller was not going to be the malleable rural innocent his father had implied. She was intelligent, perceptive, and apparently immune to the kind of casual charm that worked on women in Chicago society. Heinrich gestured toward the house. "Come, let's get you settled. Charlotte has prepared the guest room, and supper will be ready soon. Tomorrow we'll begin your education in earnest." The interior of the Mueller house was a revelation. Marcus had expected rustic simplicity, but instead found rooms that combined comfort with understated elegance. The furniture was handcrafted but sophisticated, the walls lined with books in German and English. The overall atmosphere one of cultured prosperity rather than rural isolation. Charlotte noticed his surprise. "Did you expect us to be eating with our hands and sleeping on straw mattresses, Mr. Thornfield?" Her directness was both refreshing and unnerving. "I confess I had no clear expectations, Miss Mueller. I'm discovering that my preconceptions about rural life were rather limited." "Most city people share those limitations," she said, leading him up a staircase lined with botanical prints. "They assume that distance from urban centers means distance from civilization. In reality, we simply choose to live differently, not less intelligently." The guest room was comfortable and clean, with a view of the fields that stretched toward the horizon. Marcus set his suitcase on a wooden chest and turned to find Charlotte studying him with the same direct gaze she had used. Outside. "May I ask you something, Mr. Thornfield?" she said, closing the door behind her with a casualness that suggested she was accustomed to speaking her mind. "Of course. Why are you really here?" The question struck him like a physical blow. He had prepared for suspicion, but not for such direct confrontation. "I'm not sure I understand. You're the son of Augustus Thornfield, one of the most powerful men in the railroad industry. You have access to the finest agricultural consultants, the most advanced research facilities, the most comprehensive transportation data in the country. Yet you've come to a small farming community in Illinois to learn about freight efficiency from people who ship their grain in the same cars their grandfathers used." Marcus felt his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. Charlotte Mueller was not just intelligent. She was insightful enough to see through the cover story that had seemed so plausible in Chicago. "I wanted to understand agricultural production from the ground up, to see how farming actually works rather than just reading reports about it." "That's a reasonable answer," she said, but her tone suggested she found it incomplete. "But it doesn't explain why you chose our farm specifically, or why you're willing to spend months living among people you've never met to learn things you could discover in a few weeks of systematic study." The interrogation was gentle but relentless. Marcus realized that Charlotte had done her own research, had somehow learned about his background and his father's business methods. She was testing him, trying to determine whether he was a genuine student or something more dangerous. "Perhaps I wanted to understand the people behind the production," he said, hoping to find a truthful answer that would satisfy her curiosity, without revealing his real purpose. "Numbers tell you about efficiency, but they don't tell you about the human cost of that efficiency." Something in her expression shifted, a subtle softening that suggested he had said something that resonated with her own concerns. "The human cost is considerable, Mr. Thornfield. Railroad companies tend to view farmers as suppliers rather than partners, as sources of freight revenue rather than people trying to make a living from the land." Marcus felt a stab of recognition. Charlotte Mueller understood exactly what his father represented: the systematic exploitation disguised as business efficiency. She was warning him that she knew the game and would not be easily manipulated. "I'm beginning to understand that," he said quietly. "I hope to learn enough during my stay to change some of those perceptions." "Change them in whom?" "Your father's company, the railroad industry, or just in yourself?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Marcus realized that Charlotte was offering him a choice, a chance to be honest about his purposes and his limitations. But honesty would mean admitting that he was here to manipulate her, to use her family's trust for corporate gain. "I'm not sure I have the power to change anything beyond my own understanding," he said finally. "But I hope that understanding might lead to better decisions in the future." She nodded slowly, as if his response had confirmed something she had suspected. "That's a modest ambition, Mr. Thornfield, but perhaps modesty is what we need more of in discussions between farmers and railroad men." The conversation was interrupted by Heinrich's voice calling from downstairs. "Charlotte, Marcus, supper is ready." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. "One more thing, Mr. Thornfield. My father is a generous man who believes in giving people the benefit of the doubt. But I'm more skeptical about the motives of men who come bearing gifts they haven't earned. If you're here to learn, you'll find willing teachers. If you're here for any other reason, you'll find the lessons much more difficult." She left him alone with the implications of her warning. Marcus sat on the bed, his head in his hands, trying to process what had just happened. Charlotte Mueller was not just intelligent and perceptive. She was actively suspicious of his presence. She had somehow identified him as a potential threat and was prepared to defend her family's interests. The sound of voices from downstairs reminded him that the performance had to continue. He changed into cleaner clothes and made his way to the dining room, where Heinrich was waiting with another man Marcus didn't recognize. "Marcus," Heinrich said, rising from his chair, "I'd like you to meet James Morrison, our neighbor and one of the most experienced farmers in the valley." "James, this is the young man I told you about." Morrison was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested he had seen every type of human deception. He shook Marcus's hand with a grip that seemed designed to test his character. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Thornfield," Morrison said. "Heinrich tells me you're interested in learning about our farming methods. I hope you're prepared for an education that doesn't come from books." "I'm looking forward to it," Marcus replied, though he was beginning to understand that his education would involve more than agricultural techniques. Charlotte appeared from the kitchen, carrying a platter of roasted chicken, her movements efficient and graceful. She had changed into a dress that was slightly more formal than her garden clothes, and Marcus noticed how the evening light from the windows brought out the intelligence in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison," she said, setting the platter on the table, I was telling Mr. Thornfield about the challenges farmers face in dealing with railroad companies. Perhaps you could share some of your experiences with freight rates and shipping schedules. Morrison's expression darkened slightly. I'd be happy to, Miss Charlotte. Though I'm not sure Mr. Thornfield will enjoy hearing about the way his father's company has been treating farmers in this valley. Marcus felt the room grow tense. This was not going to be a friendly discussion about agricultural techniques. Charlotte and Morrison were planning to confront him with the reality of his father's business practices, to force him to defend policies he privately disagreed with. I'm here to learn, Marcus said carefully. I may not like everything I hear, but I need to understand the full picture if I'm going to be of any use to anyone. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's a good attitude, son. Let me tell you about what happened to the Kowalski farm last year, and you can tell me if that sounds like the kind of efficiency your railroad is famous for. The story that followed was a catalog of corporate callousness. The Kowalski family had contracted with the railroad to ship their grain harvest, but delays in providing freight cars had forced them to store their crops in temporary facilities. When the cars finally arrived, they were in poor condition, and much of the grain was damaged during transport. The railroad had refused to accept responsibility, claiming that the damage was due to improper storage rather than inadequate equipment. The Kowalskis lost nearly half their income that year, Morrison concluded. They had to sell part of their land to pay their debts, and they're still struggling to recover. Now tell me, Mr. Thornfield, how does that kind of efficiency benefit anyone? Except the railroad company. Marcus felt sick. He recognized the incident from company reports, where it had been described as a minor dispute over shipping procedures. The human cost had been reduced to a single line item in a quarterly damage settlement summary. I can't defend what happened to the Kowalski family, Marcus said quietly. It sounds like they were treated unfairly, and I'm sorry for their suffering. Sorry doesn't pay their mortgage, Morrison said bluntly. But I appreciate the honesty. Most railroad men would have tried to blame the farmers for not following proper procedures. Charlotte had been listening silently, but now she spoke up. The question, Mr. Thornfield, is whether you're here to learn about these problems so you can help solve them, or whether you're just gathering information for your father's company to use against us. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus realized that his cover story had been completely transparent to these people. They knew he was here on his father's business, and they were giving him a chance to prove that he was different from the corporate representatives they had dealt with before. I can't promise to solve problems that are bigger than my authority, Marcus said finally. But I can promise that I'll try to understand them honestly, and that I'll do whatever I can to prevent similar situations in the future. Heinrich had been listening without comment, but now he leaned forward. That's a fair answer, Marcus. Understanding is the first step toward change, and change is always possible for those willing to work for it. The conversation continued through the evening, with Morrison and Charlotte sharing more stories about the railroad's impact on farming communities. Marcus found himself genuinely engaged, not just as a spy gathering intelligence, but as someone beginning to understand the human cost of his father's business methods. As the evening wound down, Charlotte walked into the porch while Heinrich and Morrison discussed plans for the next day's work. The night air was cool and clean, filled with the sounds of rural life, cattle lowing in distant fields, the whisper of wind through growing grain, the calls of night birds returning from their southern migrations. You handled that well, Charlotte said, surprising him with what seemed like genuine approval. I was prepared for you to defend your father's policies or to claim ignorance about their effects. I couldn't defend something I know is wrong, Marcus replied, and claiming ignorance would have been an insult to your intelligence. She smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her. You're learning already, Mr. Thornfield. Perhaps there's hope for you after all. As Marcus prepared for bed that night, he realized that his mission had already become more complicated than his father had anticipated. Charlotte Mueller was not just intelligent and suspicious. She was actively working to educate him about the moral implications of his family's business. She was trying to convert him, to make him an ally rather than an enemy. The irony was not lost on him. He had come to the Richland Valley to manipulate her, but she was the one doing the manipulating, using his guilty conscience and his genuine desire to be a better person to transform him into someone who might actually deserve her trust. Question was whether he would have the courage to let that transformation continue, or whether he would ultimately choose loyalty to his father over loyalty to his own better nature. The rooster's crow shattered Marcus's sleep at 5:30 in the morning, a sound so alien to his urban experience that he jolted upright in confusion before remembering where he was. Through the window he could see the first gray light of dawn spreading across the prairie, and already there were signs of activity in the barnyard below. He dressed quickly in the work clothes Charlotte had suggested he purchase in town, noting how the rough fabric felt against skin accustomed to silk and fine cotton. The transformation was more than cosmetic. Each morning brought new reminders that he was stepping into a world where his inherited advantages meant nothing. Heinrich was already in the barn when Marcus arrived, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency as he distributed feed to the livestock. The old farmer nodded approvingly at Marcus's promptness, then handed him a pitchfork without ceremony. "Today we mucked the stalls," Heinrich said simply. "Not glamorous work, but necessary. The animals depend on us for clean living conditions, just as we depend on them for our livelihood." The work was backbreaking and humbling. Marcus had imagined that his engineering education would give him insights into agricultural efficiency. But he quickly discovered that farming was as much about endurance as intelligence. His soft hands developed blisters within hours, his back ached from the constant bending and lifting, and his expensive boots proved completely inadequate for the muddy conditions. Charlotte appeared in the barn doorway around 7, carrying a wooden bucket and wearing a practical apron over her work dress. She surveyed Marcus's progress with an expression that might have been amusement. "You're working too hard," she observed. "Farming is about rhythm, not force. You'll exhaust yourself before noon if you keep attacking the work like an enemy to be conquered." She demonstrated the proper technique, showing him how to use the pitchfork's leverage rather than his back muscles, how to work steadily rather than frantically. Her movements were graceful and efficient, the result of years of practice and an intuitive understanding of physical labor. "Where did you learn to move like that?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about the source of her competence. "My mother died when I was 14, Charlotte replied matter-of-factly. "Someone had to help my father manage the household and the farm. I learned because I had to learn." The simple statement revealed depths of character that Marcus was only beginning to understand. Charlotte had been forced to assume adult responsibilities at an age when most girls were still playing with dolls. She had learned to run a household, manage livestock, and contribute to every aspect of farm operations because her family's survival depended on it. "That must have been difficult," Marcus said, trying to imagine the weight of such early responsibility. "Difficult. Situations create strong people," she replied. "My mother used to say that life doesn't ask permission before it changes your circumstances. The question is whether you adapt or let yourself be broken by the changes." The philosophy was both pragmatic and profound, reflecting the kind of wisdom that emerged from direct experience with hardship. Marcus realized that Charlotte's strength was not just intellectual but deeply practical, forged in the daily realities of rural life. As the days passed, Marcus found himself drawn into the rhythms of farm work with surprising enthusiasm. He learned to milk cows without being kicked, to harness horses without tangling the traces, to read the subtle signs that indicated when crops needed water or when livestock were showing signs of illness. The work was exhausting but satisfying in ways that his previous life had never provided. More importantly, he began to understand the complex relationships that bound the farming community together. The Mullers' nearest neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Patterson, depended on Heinrich's help during planting and harvest in exchange for her expertise in preserving food for the winter months. The Morrison family provided veterinary care for the community's livestock, while the Brennans operated a small mill that processed grain for anyone who needed it. It was a network of mutual interdependence that had nothing to do with corporate hierarchies or profit margins. People helped each other because they shared common challenges and because their individual survival depended on collective success. The contrast with his father's business philosophy could not have been more stark. Charlotte seemed to take pleasure in his gradual education. She would appear at unexpected moments to correct his technique, share bits of agricultural wisdom, or simply observe his progress with that direct gaze that seemed to see through all pretense. Her presence was both encouraging and unnerving, a constant reminder that he was being evaluated according to standards he was only beginning to understand. "You're learning faster than I expected," she told him one evening as they walked through the fields, checking the progress of the spring planting. "Most city men either give up after a few days or convince themselves that their way of doing things is superior to ours." "Maybe I'm more desperate than most city men," Marcus replied, then immediately regretted the slip. The comment revealed more about his psychological state than he had intended. Charlotte stopped walking and turned to face him. Desperate for what? The question forced him to confront truths he had been avoiding. He was desperate to prove himself, worthy of something beyond his inherited wealth, desperate to discover whether he could earn respect through his own efforts rather than his father's reputation. But admitting these things would mean acknowledging that his entire previous life had been built on foundations he no longer trusted. "Desperate to understand who I am when I'm not defined by my father's expectations," he said finally, surprised by his own honesty. "And what are you discovering?" Marcus looked out across the fields, where the evening light turned the young crops into waves of green and gold. "I'm discovering that I prefer being judged by what I can do rather than who I'm supposed to be." Charlotte smiled, and for a moment her expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "That's a dangerous discovery for someone in your position. It's much easier to live up to inherited expectations than to create your own standards." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Morrison, who approached them with the purposeful stride of a man bearing important news. His expression was grim, and Marcus felt a chill of apprehension as he recognized the signs of serious trouble. "Heinrich asked me to find you," Morrison said to Charlotte. "We've got visitors at the house. Railroad men, asking questions about property values and shipping agreements." Charlotte's face hardened instantly. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest they're planning something we won't like. They're being polite about it, but they're clearly surveying the area for some kind of development project." Marcus felt his stomach drop. His father had promised to wait for his report before taking any action, but Augustus Thornfield was not a man who trusted anyone completely, including his own son. The railroad surveyors were probably gathering information to support the expansion project, insurance against the possibility that Marcus's mission might fail. "Did they say which company they represented?" Charlotte asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Midwest Continental Railroad," Morrison replied. They had papers signed by Augustus Thornfield himself, authorizing them to conduct preliminary surveys of the entire valley. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. His father had betrayed him, or more accurately, had never trusted him to succeed in the first place. The surveyors were probably the advance guard of a more aggressive approach, one that would use legal and financial pressure to force the farmers into compliance. Charlotte turned to Marcus with an expression of cold fury. "Did you know about this?" The question hung between them like an accusation. Marcus realized that his entire mission had been compromised. That Charlotte would now view everything he had said and done as part of an elaborate deception. The trust he had been working to build was about to be shattered by his father's impatience. "I didn't know they were coming," he said truthfully. "My father promised to wait for my assessment before taking any action." "Your assessment of what?" Charlotte's voice was dangerously quiet. Marcus looked at her face, seeing the intelligence and strength that had impressed him from their first meeting, and realized that he could not continue the deception. She deserved better than to be lied to by someone she had been generous enough to trust. "My assessment of whether the farming community could be convinced to cooperate with railroad expansion through the valley," he said quietly. "I was sent here to determine the best approach for securing right-of-way agreements." The silence that followed was devastating. Charlotte stared at him with an expression that combined disappointment, anger, and something that might have been hurt. Morrison cursed under his breath and turned away, as if he could not bear to witness Marcus's humiliation. "So everything you've said, everything you've done, has been part of a plan to manipulate us into giving up our land," Charlotte said finally. "It started that way," Marcus admitted, "but it's become something different. I've learned things here that I never expected to learn, discovered aspects of myself that I didn't know existed." "How convenient for you," Charlotte said bitterly. "You've had a nice vacation from your privileged life while gathering intelligence about our weaknesses and vulnerabilities." The accusation was unfair but understandable. From Charlotte's perspective, Marcus had been playing a role, pretending to be interested in farming while actually serving as a spy for the railroad company. The fact that his feelings had become genuine was irrelevant to the damage his deception had caused. "I know you have no reason to believe me," Marcus said desperately, "but I've come to care about this community, about the people who live here. I don't want to see the railroad destroy what you've built." "Then why didn't you tell us the truth from the beginning?" Charlotte demanded. "Why didn't you trust us enough to be honest about your father's plans?" The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Marcus's position. He had been so focused on following his father's instructions that he had never considered the possibility of an alternative approach. He had assumed that the farmers would be his enemies rather than potential allies. That deception was necessary because cooperation was impossible. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I was afraid of disappointing my father, afraid of losing my inheritance, afraid of discovering that I wasn't strong enough to stand up for what I believed was right." Charlotte studied his face with that penetrating gaze he had come to know so well. "And now?" "Now I'm more afraid of disappointing you than disappointing him," Marcus replied. Surprised by the truth of his own words, the admission hung between them like a bridge that might either connect them or collapse under the weight of what had been revealed. Charlotte's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Words are easy, Marcus. What matters is what you do next." Before he could respond, Heinrich approached from the direction of the house, his face grave with concern. "The railroad men are gone," he announced. "But they left papers requiring us to appear at a hearing next week to discuss eminent domain proceedings." Marcus felt the world shifting beneath his feet. Eminent domain meant that the railroad was prepared to take the land by force, using government authority to override the farmers' property rights. It was the nuclear option, the approach his father used when all other methods failed. "They can't take our land without just compensation," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They can if they convince a judge that railroad expansion serves the public interest," Heinrich replied. "And Augustus Thornfield has enough political influence to make that argument very persuasive." Charlotte turned back to Marcus, her eyes blazing with angry determination. "So this is how your father operates when he doesn't get his way. When he can't manipulate us into compliance, he simply steals what he wants." "This isn't what I wanted," Marcus protested. "This isn't what I was trying to accomplish." "But it's what you made possible," Charlotte said. "Your mission was to gather information about our defenses, our weaknesses, our internal divisions. Now your father has that information. And he's using it to destroy us. The accusation was devastating because it was partially true. Marcus had provided his father with detailed reports about the farming community's financial situation, their leadership structure, their potential vulnerabilities. That information was now being used to design a legal assault that would be difficult to defend against. "I can help you fight this," Marcus said urgently. "I know how my father operates, how he thinks, what strategies he's likely to use. I can help you prepare a defense. Why should we trust you?" Morrison demanded. "You've been lying to us from the moment you arrived. How do we know this isn't just another level of deception?" The question was fair but painful. Marcus realized that his betrayal had cost him more than Charlotte's trust. It had damaged his credibility with the entire community. Even if he genuinely wanted to help them, they had no reason to believe his motives were pure. "Because I'm willing to burn every bridge I have with my father's company," Marcus said desperately. "Because I'm willing to testify against him in court, to reveal every dirty trick he's ever used to steal land from farmers." Charlotte's eyes widened slightly at the offer. "You would do that? You would destroy your own inheritance to help us?" "My inheritance is built on the suffering of people like you," Marcus replied. "I've seen what that wealth really costs, and I don't want to pay that price anymore." The declaration surprised him with its finality. He had been moving toward this moment for weeks, but until he spoke the words aloud, he hadn't realized how completely his priorities had shifted. The prospect of losing his father's approval, his position in the company, his comfortable future, no longer seemed as important as earning the respect of people who had shown him what genuine integrity looked like. Heinrich had been listening to the conversation with growing interest. "If you're serious about helping us," he said slowly, "we need to know everything you can tell us about your father's legal strategies, his political connections, his financial resources. We need to understand what we're fighting against. And we need to know it quickly," Morrison added. "The hearing is next week, and we'll need time to prepare our response." Charlotte was still studying Marcus with that penetrating gaze, as if she were trying to read his soul. "This isn't a game, Marcus. If you help us fight your father, there will be no going back. He won't forgive you, and he won't forget what you've done." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "But I can't go back to pretending that what he does is acceptable. I can't live with myself if I let him destroy everything you've built here." The moment stretched between them like a test of wills. Charlotte's decision would determine not just Marcus's fate, but the community's approach to the coming legal battle. She had the power to accept his offer of help or reject it as another deception, and Marcus realized that he had never wanted anything more than her trust. Finally she nodded. "Then we'd better get started. We have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it." As they walked back toward the house, Marcus felt the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had chosen sides in a conflict that would define the rest of his life, and there would be no hiding from the consequences. But for the first time since arriving in the Richland Valley, he felt like he was finally being honest about who he wanted to become. The real test would come when he faced his father's retaliation, when the comfortable world of his childhood was stripped away and he was forced to survive on his own merits. But as he glanced at Charlotte's profile in the gathering dusk, he realized that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight meant losing everything he had previously valued. The deception was ending, but the real battle was just beginning. The emergency meeting convened in the Brennan farmhouse on a rainy Thursday evening, exactly 3 days before the scheduled eminent domain hearing. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the faces of 15 farmers gathered around the kitchen table, their expressions grim as they studied the legal documents that would determine their fate. Marcus sat slightly apart from the group, his presence tolerated but not welcomed. He had spent the past 2 days revealing everything he knew about his father's business tactics, his political connections, his standard legal strategies. The information was valuable, but it came from a source that nobody fully trusted. The hearing is a sham, he explained, pointing to specific clauses in the eminent domain filing. Judge Whitmore owes his appointment to political allies of my father. The railroad company has already provided economic impact studies showing how the expansion will benefit the region, and they've lined up expert witnesses to testify about the public necessity of the project. Heinrich studied the documents with the careful attention of a man who understood that his life's work hung in the balance. What about our property rights? Don't we have legal protections against arbitrary seizure? You have rights, Marcus replied, but they're being undermined by selective interpretation of the law. The railroad will argue that agricultural land represents inefficient use of resources, that industrial development serves a greater public good than individual farming operations. The argument was legally sophisticated and morally bankrupt. The kind of reasoning that transformed theft into progress by redefining the meaning of public benefit. Marcus had heard his father use similar logic countless times, always with the calm certainty of a man who believed that power justified itself. James Morrison slammed his fist on the table, causing the oil lamps to flicker. So we're supposed to just accept that our families, our communities, our entire way of life can be eliminated because some judge decides that railroad profits are more important than human beings? Not eliminated, Marcus said carefully. Relocated. The railroad is required to provide compensation for seized property, and they're offering to help affected families find new land in other regions. At prices they determine, for land they choose, in communities where we have no roots or relationships. Charlotte interjected, her voice sharp with controlled anger. They're not offering us equivalent property, Marcus. They're offering us exile. The word hung in the air like a verdict. Marcus realized that Charlotte understood something he had missed. The railroad was not just taking land, but destroying a way of life that had been built over generations. The farming community represented more than economic activity. It was a network of relationships, traditions, and shared values that could not be recreated in a new location. There has to be something we can do, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice trembling with emotion. Some way to fight back against this injustice. Marcus looked around the table at faces that reflected exhaustion, fear, and the kind of stubborn determination that had brought these families through countless hardships. They were asking him to provide a solution to a problem his own family had created, to find a way to defeat an enemy he understood better than anyone else in the room. There is one possibility, he said slowly, but it would require you to trust me completely, and it would put everyone at considerable risk. What kind of risk? Heinrich asked. The risk of making my father angry enough to abandon legal proceedings in favor of more direct action, Marcus replied. Augustus Thornfield is a civilized man as long as civilization serves his purposes. When it doesn't, he becomes something else entirely. The warning was not rhetorical. Marcus had seen his father's capacity for ruthless action when crossed by competitors or regulatory authorities. Legal battles were expensive and time-consuming. Intimidation was cheap and effective. The railroad employed security forces that specialized in persuading reluctant communities to accept corporate offers. What's your proposal? Charlotte asked, her tone suggesting that she was prepared to hear something she might not like. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would commit him to a course of action that would destroy his relationship with his father forever. I propose that we expose the entire scheme publicly, reveal every detail of the railroad's manipulation and corruption. We make it impossible for them to proceed without destroying their reputation and their political relationships. How do we do that? Morrison asked skeptically. Who's going to believe a handful of farmers over Augustus Thornfield? They'll believe me, Marcus said quietly. I have access to internal company documents, correspondence between my father and government officials, records of bribes and political favors. I know where the bodies are buried, and I'm willing to dig them up. The proposal was audacious and dangerous. By revealing his father's secrets, Marcus would be committing corporate treason, violating every principle of family loyalty and business confidentiality. But he would also be providing the farming community with weapons powerful enough to destroy the railroad's carefully constructed public image. "You're talking about destroying your own family," Heinrich said, his voice heavy with concern. You prepared for that kind of sacrifice." "My family destroyed itself a long time ago," Marcus replied. "I'm just finally admitting it." The meeting continued past midnight, with the farmers debating the risks and potential benefits of Marcus's proposal. Some argued for accepting the railroad's compensation and relocating their families to safer regions. Others advocated for armed resistance, suggesting that property rights were worth fighting for regardless of the legal consequences. Charlotte listened to the debate with growing frustration, her intelligence and moral clarity cutting through the confusion that paralyzed the others. Finally, she stood and faced the group with the kind of quiet authority that commanded instant attention. "We're not going to run away from our homes," she said firmly. "And we're not going to let fear make us into the kind of people who solve problems with violence. We're going to fight this legally, publicly, and with every resource we can gather, even if it means trusting someone who has already betrayed us once." Morrison challenged. Charlotte turned to Marcus with that penetrating gaze he had come to know so well. People deserve a chance to redeem themselves, especially when they're willing to risk everything to do what's right. The endorsement was unexpected and powerful. Charlotte's opinion carried enormous weight within the farming community, and her willingness to trust Marcus despite his deception would influence how the others responded to his proposal. "I have one condition," she continued, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "If we're going to do this, we do it completely. No half measures, no attempts to protect your father's reputation or preserve your inheritance. We expose everything, and we let the consequences fall where they may." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that Charlotte was asking him to prove his commitment through absolute honesty. She was offering him redemption, but only if he was willing to accept the complete destruction of his previous life. "Everything," he agreed. "Every document, every conversation, every corrupt deal I've ever witnessed. I'll burn it all down if that's what it takes." The decision was made by consensus, with even the most skeptical farmers agreeing that Marcus's information was too valuable to ignore. They would spend the next 2 days preparing for the hearing, gathering evidence and preparing testimony that would transform a legal proceeding into a public scandal. As the meeting broke up, Charlotte approached Marcus while the others filed out into the rain. "You understand what you're doing?" she asked quietly. "Once you testify against your father, there will be no forgiveness, no reconciliation. You'll be cutting yourself off from everything you've ever known." "I know," Marcus said, "but I've discovered something here that I never had in Chicago. I've learned what it feels like to be valued for who I am rather than what I inherit." Charlotte's expression softened slightly. "And what have you learned about who you are?" "I've learned that I'm someone who cares more about earning your respect than preserving my father's empire," Marcus replied, surprised by the honesty of his own words. They stood in the doorway watching the rain fall across the fields, each lost in thoughts about the battle that lay ahead. The silence was comfortable now, the tension between them transformed into something that might eventually become trust. "There's something else you should know," Charlotte said finally. The railroad surveyors weren't just mapping property boundaries. They were also asking questions about the community's leadership, about potential divisions among the farmers, about who might be willing to negotiate separately from the group. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. "They're planning to divide you, to make individual deals with farmers who might be willing to break ranks." "Exactly. And they were particularly interested in learning about any connections between the farming community and outside interests." They asked specifically about railroad executives who might be sympathetic to our cause. The implication was clear. Augustus had suspected that his son might be compromised by his assignment, and the surveyors had been instructed to gather intelligence about Marcus's activities. The old man was always one step ahead, always prepared for the possibility that his carefully laid plans might be disrupted by human weakness. "He knows," Marcus said quietly. "My father knows that I've been turned, that I'm no longer reliable. The hearing isn't just about seizing your land. It's about neutralizing me as a threat to his plans." Charlotte nodded grimly. "Which means we need to move faster than he expects. We need to reveal everything before he has a chance to discredit your testimony or eliminate you as a witness." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a horseman, his mount lathered with sweat and his clothes soaked from the rain. Marcus recognized him immediately. Thomas Brennan's eldest son, who had been posted as a lookout near the main road. "Riders coming," the young man announced breathlessly. "A dozen men, maybe more. They're not wearing any identifying marks, but they're armed and they're moving with purpose." Marcus felt his blood freeze. His father's security forces had arrived, the men who specialized in persuading reluctant communities to accept corporate offers. They would not engage in open violence, but they would make it clear that resistance carried a price that few families could afford to pay. "How long do we have?" Charlotte asked, her voice calm despite the danger. 20 minutes, maybe less," Brennan replied. "They're moving slowly, probably scouting the area before they make their approach." Charlotte turned to Marcus with an expression of steely determination. "This is it. This is your moment to choose who you really are." The test had come sooner than expected, but Marcus felt surprisingly calm as he considered his options. He could flee, disappear into the night, and hope that his father's men would not pursue him. He could attempt to negotiate, to use his family connection to protect the farming community from immediate violence. Or he could stand and fight, accepting the consequences of his betrayal and proving that his conversion was genuine. "I'm staying," he said simply. "Whatever happens, I'm staying." Charlotte smiled, and for the first time since he had known her, the expression was filled with genuine warmth. "Then we'd better get ready to give them a welcome they'll never forget." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of preparation. The farmers who had attended the meeting were alerted to the approaching danger, and they responded with the kind of coordinated efficiency that came from years of mutual dependence. Weapons were distributed, defensive positions were established, and messages were sent to alert the rest of the community. Marcus found himself assigned to a position near the main house, armed with a hunting rifle and partnered with James Morrison. The older man had not spoken to him since the meeting, but as they waited in the darkness, he finally broke the silence. "You know what this means?" Morrison asked quietly. "It means I'm finally becoming the kind of man my mother wanted me to be." Marcus replied, "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who fights for what's right, even when it's difficult." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's a good thing to discover about yourself, son. Not everyone gets the chance to find out what they're really made of." The riders appeared at the edge of the property just as the rain began to intensify, their dark shapes barely visible against the storm clouds. They moved with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers, spreading out to surround the farmhouse while maintaining careful spacing to avoid presenting concentrated targets. Marcus recognized their leader immediately, Vincent Carver, his father's head of security and the man responsible for handling the railroad's most sensitive problems. Carver was a former Army officer who had learned his trade during the Indian Wars, and he approached every situation with the cold calculation of a man who viewed violence as a tool to be used when other methods failed. "Marcus Thornfield," Carver called out, his voice carrying clearly across the rain-soaked yard. "Your father sent me to escort you home. Come out quietly, and no one needs to get hurt." The offer was a trap, designed to isolate Marcus from the community that had become his refuge. Once he was separated from the farmers, Carver would have the freedom to use whatever methods were necessary to ensure their compliance with the railroad's demands. "I am home," Marcus called back, his voice steadier than he had expected. "And I'm not going anywhere." The response seemed to surprise Carver, who had probably expected the railroader to abandon his new allies at the first sign of serious danger. There was a long pause before he replied, his tone carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "Your father said you might be difficult to convince. He asked me to remind you that family loyalty is not optional, and that the consequences of betraying that loyalty extend beyond your own welfare." The threat was clear but indirect, the kind of veiled intimidation that men like Carver used to maintain plausible deniability. Marcus understood that his father was threatening not just him, but everyone who had shown him kindness, everyone who had become part of his new life. "Tell my father that I've learned the difference between loyalty and complicity," Marcus shouted back, "and that I choose to be loyal to people who deserve it." The declaration was a public severing of family ties, a final rejection of the values and expectations that had defined his entire life. Marcus felt a strange sense of liberation as the words left his mouth, as if he had finally shed a burden that had been weighing him down for years. Carver's response was immediate and decisive. He raised his hand, signaling his men to begin the assault that would force the farming community to acknowledge the futility of resistance. The battle for the Richland Valley was about to begin, and Marcus Thornfield had chosen his side. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of the life he had known and preparing the ground for whatever would grow in its place. The standoff lasted until dawn, a tense game of nerves played out in the cold rain between two forces that understood the stakes with crystalline clarity. Vincent Carver's men had surrounded the Mueller farmhouse, but they made no move to advance. The farmers had taken defensive positions throughout the property, their hunting rifles surrounded on shadows that moved like ghosts through the storm. Marcus crouched behind a stone wall beside the barn, his hand steady on his weapon despite the magnitude of what was happening. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, publicly defying his father in front of witnesses who would carry the story throughout the region. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation, no return to the privileged life he had abandoned. As the first gray light of morning crept across the prairie, Carver made his decision. Rather than risk a confrontation that might leave bodies on the ground and questions that would be difficult to answer, he withdrew his men with the disciplined efficiency of a military retreat. But not before delivering a final message that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "This isn't over, Marcus," he called out as his riders gathered at the edge of the property. "Your father is a patient man, but he's not a forgiving one. Think carefully about what you're throwing away." The warning echoed across the farmyard like a funeral bell, a reminder that Augustus Thornfield had resources and connections that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Richland Valley. The old man had built his empire by crushing opposition, and he would not allow his own son's betrayal to go unanswered. Charlotte emerged from the house as the security forces disappeared into the morning mist, her face pale but determined. She had spent the night organizing the community's resistance, coordinating with neighboring farms, and preparing for the legal battle that would determine their fate. Her strength had held the farmers together when fear might have driven them apart. "They'll be back," she said quietly, watching the empty road where Carver's men had vanished. "Your father won't give up just because we showed him we're willing to fight." Marcus nodded, understanding that the confrontation had been a test of resolve rather than a genuine attempt to seize the property. Augustus was measuring the community's determination, calculating the cost of different approaches, preparing for a campaign that would systematically destroy his opponent's ability to resist. "We need to move faster than he expects," Marcus said, his voice carrying the urgency of a man who understood his father's methods. "We need to get our story out before he can discredit us or eliminate the evidence." The next few hours were a blur of desperate activity. Marcus spent the morning in Heinrich's study, writing out detailed accounts of every corrupt transaction he had witnessed, every bribe he had seen passed, every illegal manipulation of government officials. The documents were copied by hand and distributed to trusted messengers who would carry them to newspapers in Chicago, St. Louis, and Springfield. Charlotte coordinated the broader resistance effort, sending riders to alert farmers throughout the valley, organizing legal challenges to the eminent domain proceedings, and preparing testimony that would expose the railroad's systematic intimidation tactics. Her intelligence and organizational skills transformed a collection of independent farmers into a coordinated political force. By afternoon, the first responses began to arrive. The Chicago Tribune had assigned a reporter to investigate the story, intrigued by allegations of corruption involving one of the city's most prominent businessmen. The Illinois Attorney General's office was opening a preliminary into the railroad's land acquisition practices. Political allies of Augustus Thornfield were quietly distancing themselves from the controversy. But Augustus was not passive in the face of this assault on his reputation. His counterattack came with the swift precision of a military operation, designed to destroy his opponent's credibility before they could inflict irreparable damage on his empire. The first blow fell at mid-afternoon, when a delegation of federal marshals arrived at the Mueller farmhouse with warrants for Marcus's arrest. The charges were serious: theft of corporate property, violation of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to defraud the Midwest Continental Railroad. The legal language was technical, but the message was clear. Augustus was using the criminal justice system to silence his son. "The warrants are signed by Federal Judge Harrison," the lead marshal explained apologetically. "I'm sorry, son, but you'll need to come with us." Marcus recognized the name immediately. Judge Harrison was a longtime family friend who had benefited from numerous railroad investments over the years. The arrest warrants were legally valid but morally corrupt, another example of his father's ability to manipulate the system for personal advantage. "I'll go with them," Marcus told Charlotte, who had appeared at his side with the fierce protectiveness of a mother defending her child. "But make sure the documents get delivered. Don't let them stop the story from getting out." "We won't let them silence you," Charlotte replied, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had found a cause worth dying for. "And we won't let them destroy what we've built here." The ride to the county jail was a journey through a landscape that had become home to Marcus in ways that Chicago never had. He watched the farms pass by, each one representing a family that had welcomed him, taught him, shown him what it meant to live with integrity. The irony was not lost on him that he was being arrested for learning to be a better person. The jail cell was small and uncomfortable, but it provided Marcus with something he had not expected: time to think clearly about the choices he had made and the consequences he was prepared to accept. He had traded his inheritance for his integrity, his family's approval for the respect of people who had earned his admiration. It was a bargain he would make again without hesitation. Charlotte visited him the next morning, bringing news that was both encouraging and ominous. The Chicago Tribune had published a front-page story about the railroad's corrupt practices, complete with documentation that Marcus had provided. The article was causing a sensation in political circles, with calls for investigations and demands for accountability. "Your father's stock price dropped 15% in the first hour of trading," Charlotte reported with grim satisfaction. "The board of directors is meeting in emergency session, and several major investors are threatening to withdraw their support." But Augustus's retaliation was swift and devastating. By evening, Charlotte brought different news. The Midwest Continental Railroad had filed bankruptcy protection for its Illinois operations, claiming that the recent controversies had made it impossible to continue business in the region. The move was a legal maneuver designed to void all existing contracts and eliminate the company's obligations to local communities. "What does that mean for the land seizure?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It means Your father is abandoning the legal approach in favor of something more direct, Charlotte replied. He's transferred ownership of the disputed property to a subsidiary company that specializes in industrial development. They're not bound by the same regulations that govern railroad operations. The strategy was brilliant and ruthless. Augustus had sacrificed his original expansion plans in order to create a new legal entity that could pursue the same objectives without the constraints of public scrutiny. The subsidiary company would be free to use whatever methods were necessary to acquire the land, including techniques that would be unacceptable for a publicly traded corporation. He's going to try to starve us out, Marcus said, understanding his father's strategy with the clarity of someone who had been trained in the same school of business warfare. He'll use economic pressure, legal harassment, and systematic intimidation to make it impossible for the farming community to survive. Charlotte's expression hardened with the kind of determination that had carried her through every challenge in her life. Then we'll have to prove that we're stronger than he thinks we are. The battle for the Richland Valley entered a new phase, one that would test not just the farmers' resolve, but their ability to survive as a community under sustained assault. Augustus's subsidiary company began buying up properties adjacent to the valley, creating a ring of hostile ownership that would make it difficult for the farmers to transport their crops or access essential services without local banks. Influenced by Thornfield money, began calling in loans and refusing to extend credit to farming operations. The railroad connections that the community had depended on for shipping their grain were mysteriously disrupted, with freight cars arriving damaged or not at all. Government inspectors appeared with increasing frequency, finding violations of regulations that had been ignored for decades. Marcus watched the systematic destruction of the community from his jail cell, his frustration growing with each report of new harassment. He had provided the farmers with valuable intelligence, but his father's resources seemed unlimited. Every move they made was countered by a response that demonstrated the vast difference between their modest resources and the industrial empire. They were fighting. The turning point came when Charlotte appeared at his cell window one evening, her face illuminated by the light of a lantern and marked by a determination that seemed to burn from within. "I need you to write one more document," she said quietly. "Something that will end this once and for all." "What kind of document?" Marcus asked, though something in her tone suggested that she was planning something dangerous. "A confession. Not about your father's crimes, but about your own. I want you to write down everything you did during your time with us. Every deception, every manipulation, every moment when you chose to serve your father's interests over ours." The request was puzzling and potentially self-destructive. "Charlotte, that would destroy any credibility I have left. It would make it impossible for me to testify against my father." "That's exactly what I'm hoping for," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found a solution that others had missed. "Your father is using your arrest to discredit everything we've said about his business practices. He's claiming that you're a disgruntled son trying to destroy his reputation out of spite." Marcus began to understand. "But if I confess to being his agent, if I admit that I came here to spy on you, then you become the evidence of his guilt rather than just another accuser," Charlotte finished. "Your confession proves that he sent you here to gather intelligence, that he was planning to steal our land from the beginning, that everything we've claimed about his methods is true. The strategy was brilliant and devastating." Marcus's confession would transform him from a witness into evidence, from someone making accusations into proof of the accusation's validity. It would also destroy any possibility of reconciliation with his father, but that bridge had already been burned beyond repair. "If I write this confession, I'll be admitting that I betrayed your trust, that I manipulated your family's hospitality for corporate gain," Marcus said slowly. "You'll have legal grounds to sue me for fraud, conspiracy, any number of criminal charges." Charlotte's smile was sad but determined. "I know. And I'm prepared to forgive you anyway. because I've seen who you really are underneath the deception. But the world needs to see the truth about what your father is capable of, and your confession is the only way to prove it." The request was a test of Marcus's commitment to the cause he had chosen. Charlotte was asking him to sacrifice not just his relationship with his father, but his own legal protection, to make himself vulnerable to prosecution in order to expose the corruption that had shaped his entire life. "I'll write it," Marcus said quietly. "But I want you to know that everything I've felt for you, everything I've learned about myself during my time here, that was real. The deception was my father's, but the transformation was mine." "I know," Charlotte replied, her voice softening with something that might have been affection. "And that's why I'm willing to risk everything to save what we've built together." As Marcus began to write his confession, he realized that Charlotte Mueller had done something his father had never managed to accomplish. She had inspired him to become the kind of man who would choose truth over comfort, justice over security, love over fear. The irony was perfect. Augustus had sent his son to manipulate a farmer's daughter, but she had ended up converting the manipulator into someone worthy of the cause he had been sent to betray. The confession would be his final gift to the community that had given him a new life, and to the woman who had shown him what it meant to live with integrity. Tomorrow the battle would enter its final phase, and Marcus Thornfield would stand with the people who had taught him the difference between inherited wealth and earned respect. The reckoning was at hand, and for the first time in his life, Marcus was ready to face the consequences of choosing what was right over what was easy. The confession arrived at the offices of the Chicago Tribune on a Tuesday morning in late April, delivered by a rider who had traveled through the night to avoid the railroad surveillance network. The document was 15 pages of meticulous handwriting, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage on the empire that had created it. Marcus had spent 3 days crafting the confession, pouring out every detail of his mission to the Richland Valley, every conversation with his father, every moment of moral compromise that had led him to betray the trust of people who had shown him nothing but kindness. The document was devastating in its honesty, a surgical dissection of corporate corruption that named names, provided dates, and offered evidence that would be impossible to discredit. "My name is Marcus Thornfield," the confession began, "and I was sent to the Richland Valley by my father, Augustus Thornfield, to infiltrate the farming community and gather intelligence that would facilitate the illegal seizure of their land." What follows is a complete account of that mission and the systematic corruption that made it possible. The Tribune's editor, William Sterling, read the confession with growing amazement. He had covered dozens of corporate scandals during his career, but none had been exposed with such intimate detail by someone so close to the center of power. The document was a journalist's dream, a first-person account of industrial espionage that implicated some of the most powerful men in the state. But Sterling was also a careful man who understood the legal implications of publishing such explosive material. The confession would destroy Augustus Thornfield's reputation, but it would also make the newspaper vulnerable to libel suits and criminal prosecution. The story needed to be corroborated by independent sources before it could see print. That corroboration came from an unexpected source. Dr. Harrison Webb, the physician who had provided Marcus with medical cover for his mission, appeared at the Paris Tribune offices the same afternoon, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents that confirmed every detail of the confession. "I can't continue to be part of this," Dr. Webb told Sterling, his hands shaking as he spread the papers across the editor's desk. "I thought I was helping the young man recover from nervous exhaustion, but I was actually participating in a conspiracy to defraud innocent farmers of their property." The documents included correspondence between Augustus and various government officials, financial records showing payments to judges and regulatory authorities, and detailed plans for the systematic destruction of the farming community's economic base. The evidence was overwhelming and indisputable. providing legal proof of corruption that extended far beyond the Richland Valley. Sterling made his decision with the instinctive certainty of a journalist who recognized a story that would change everything. The Tribune would publish the confession and supporting documents in a special edition that would be distributed throughout the Midwest, regardless of the legal consequences. The public had a right to know how their government had been corrupted by corporate money. The special edition hit the streets on Thursday morning, its headline screaming across the front page in letters large enough to be read from across the street. Railroad heir confesses to corporate conspiracy, Thornfield empire built on fraud and corruption. The story was reprinted by newspapers across the country, creating a national scandal that reached the halls of Congress and the offices of federal prosecutors. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Augustus Thornfield's stock price collapsed, falling nearly 60% in the first hour of trading as investors fled from association with a company that had been exposed as fundamentally corrupt. The board of directors called an emergency meeting, demanding explanations that Augustus could not provide without admitting his guilt. Political allies who had benefited from Thornfield money scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, returning campaign contributions and canceling planned appearances at railroad-sponsored events. Federal prosecutors announced investigations into the conspiracy, subpoenaing records and preparing criminal charges against everyone involved in the scheme. But Augustus Thornfield was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. The confession had destroyed his reputation and his political connections, but it had also revealed the location of his greatest enemy, his own son, who sat in a jail cell just 90 miles from Chicago, unprotected by the legal system that had been designed to serve corporate interests. The old man's retaliation was swift and final. Rather than wait for the criminal justice system to process the evidence against him, Augustus chose to eliminate the source of his problems with the efficiency of a military operation. Vincent Carver received his orders by telegram that same evening. Terminate the threat. Use any means necessary. The message was clear and unambiguous. Marcus Thornfield had become too dangerous to be allowed to survive, and his father was prepared to sacrifice their blood relationship to protect what remained of his empire. The order was not just professional, but personal, the final act of a man who had chosen power over family, profit over love. Charlotte sensed the approaching danger with the intuitive certainty of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of impending violence. She had spent the day in Springfield, meeting with federal prosecutors and providing testimony that would support the criminal cases against Augustus and his associates. But as she rode back toward the Richland Valley, she felt an urgency that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. The jail in Carlinville was a modest structure that had been designed to hold drunks and petty criminals, not to withstand assault by professional killers. Charlotte arrived just as the sun was setting, her horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride, her instincts screaming that she was almost too late. Sheriff Davies met her at the front door, his face grim with the knowledge that he was facing a situation beyond his ability to control. "Miss Mueller," he said quietly, "I think you should know that we've had visitors asking about the security arrangements for our federal prisoner." "What kind of visitors?" Charlotte asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The kind that don't give their real names and don't wait for official authorization," Davies replied. They were interested in the jail's construction, the number of guards, the schedule for prisoner transport. Professional questions from professional men. Charlotte felt her blood turn cold. Augustus was planning to have his son killed, to eliminate the witness whose testimony could destroy what remained of his empire. The confession had been published, but Marcus's death would prevent him from providing additional evidence or testimony in the criminal trials that were sure to follow. "Where is he now?" Charlotte asked urgently. "Cell Block 3, maximum security," Davies said. "But Miss Mueller, I have to tell you that we're not equipped to protect him from the kind of people who might be coming. This is a county jail, not A federal prison. Charlotte's mind raced through possibilities, calculating odds and resources with the same systematic intelligence she had used to organize the farming community's resistance. The jail was vulnerable, the sheriff's department was undermanned, and Marcus was trapped in a cell that might as well have been marked with a target. "I need to see him," she said firmly. Now, Davies hesitated, understanding that he was about to violate regulations that existed for good reasons. But he also understood that Charlotte Mueller was not a woman who accepted bureaucratic obstacles when lives were at stake. "5 minutes," he said finally. "That's all I can allow." Marcus was sitting on the narrow cot in his cell, reading a book by lamplight when Charlotte appeared at the barred window. He looked up with surprise and something that might have been joy, his face lighting up with an expression she had never seen before. "Charlotte," he said, rising to approach the bars. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Your father is going to try to kill you," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who had no time for gentle explanations. "The confession has destroyed his empire, but you're still alive to provide additional testimony. He can't allow that to continue." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that he had finally pushed his father beyond the boundaries of family loyalty. "I knew this might happen," he said quietly. "I accepted that risk when I chose to tell the truth." "Well, I don't accept it," Charlotte replied fiercely. "And I'm not going to let him murder you just because you found the courage to do what was right." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of gunfire from the front of the jail, followed by shouts and the crash of breaking glass. Vincent Carver had arrived with a team of professionals, and they were not waiting for legal authorization to complete their mission. Sheriff Davies appeared at the cell block door, his face pale with fear and his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. "They're coming through the front," he said urgently. "There's a back exit, but we need to move now." Charlotte grabbed Marcus's hand through the bars, her grip strong and reassuring. "I'm getting you out of here," she said, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never accepted defeat. "But I need you to trust me completely." "I trust you," Marcus replied, and for the first time in his life, he meant those words without reservation. The escape that followed was a blur of desperate action and calculated risk. Davies unlocked the cell and led them through a maze of corridors toward the jail's rear exit, while the sound of Carver's assault grew louder and more violent. The this of Carver's assault grew louder and more violent, and more violent. Professional killers were systematically eliminating resistance, moving through the building with the efficiency of men who had performed similar operations many times before. They reached the back door just as the first of Carver's men appeared. In the corridor behind them, his weapon raised and his finger on the trigger. Charlotte shoved Marcus through the doorway and threw herself after him, the sound of gunfire echoing in the space they had just vacated. A horse was waiting in the alley, held by James Morrison, whose weathered face showed the strain of a man who understood that he was risking everything to save someone he had come to respect. "This way," he said urgently, helping Marcus mount behind Charlotte. "We've got a safe house prepared, but we need to move fast." The ride that followed was a nightmare of pursuit and evasion, with Carver's men following close behind and the sound of their horses' hooves echoing across the prairie like thunder. Charlotte rode with the skill of someone who had grown up in the saddle, guiding her mount through terrain that would have challenged a cavalry officer. They reached the safe house just as the moon was rising, abandoned farmstead that had been prepared as a refuge for exactly this kind of emergency. The building was hidden in a grove of trees, its windows darkened and its doors barricaded against assault. Heinrich Mueller was waiting inside, along with a dozen other farmers who had volunteered to serve as guards. The old man's face was grim, with the knowledge that they were facing the final test of their community's resolve. "This ends tonight," Heinrich said simply. "One way or another, this ends tonight." Charlotte nodded, understanding that her father was not just talking about Marcus's safety, but about the larger battle they had been fighting for months. Augustus Thornfield had finally overreached, had finally committed acts that would destroy him regardless of his political connections or financial resources. "The federal prosecutors are already preparing murder charges," she said quietly. "When they find out that Augustus ordered the assassination of his own son, it will be the final nail in his coffin." Marcus looked around the room at the faces of people who had risked everything to save him, people who had every reason to hate him for his deception, but who had chosen to judge him by his actions rather than his origins. The transformation was complete. He had become one of them, not through birth or inheritance, but through the choices he had made when those choices mattered most. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "None of us deserves the hand we're dealt," Charlotte replied. "But we all deserve the chance to play it with honor." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, reminding everyone that the night was far from over. Carver had found their trail, and the final confrontation was about to begin. But this time, Marcus would not be facing his father's killers alone. He would be standing with people who had shown him what it meant to fight for something greater than personal gain. The battle for the Richland Valley was about to reach its climax, and for the first time since the conflict began, Marcus Thornfield was confident about which side deserved to win. The siege of the safe house lasted until dawn, a tense standoff between Vincent, Carver's professional killers, and the farmers who had transformed themselves into defenders of their community. But as the first light of morning crept across the prairie, something unexpected happened. Federal marshals appeared on the horizon, their badges gleaming in the early sunlight. William Sterling's investigation had reached the highest levels of government, and the attempted assassination had provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to move against Augustus Thornfield with decisive force. Carver and his men found themselves surrounded, their mission transformed from execution to escape, their employer's protection evaporating with the sunrise. The confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with handcuffs, as federal agents arrested the security forces and read them charges that would put them in prison for the rest of their lives. Carver himself was taken into custody while trying to flee across the fields, his reputation as an efficient killer destroyed by his failure to complete the most important contract of his career. Marcus emerged from the safe house to find the world transformed. The immediate threat was over, but the larger implications of what had happened were just beginning to unfold. His father's empire was collapsing, his political connections were severed, and the man who had once commanded the respect of senators and governors was now a fugitive from justice. "It's over," Charlotte said simply, standing beside him as they watched the federal agents secure the scene. "Your father's power is broken, and he'll never be able to threaten us again." But Marcus understood that endings were also beginnings, and that the destruction of his father's empire would create as many problems as it solved. The Midwest Continental Railroad employed thousands of people, served dozens of communities, and formed a crucial part of the region's economic infrastructure. Its collapse would have consequences that extended far beyond the Richland Valley. "What happens now?" he asked, looking out at the fields where he had learned to find meaning in honest work. "Now we build something better," Charlotte replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had always believed that destruction could be transformed into creation. "We build something that serves people instead of exploiting them." The weeks that followed were a wind of legal proceedings, congressional hearings, and media attention that transformed the farming community into a symbol of resistance against corporate corruption. Marcus testified before federal grand juries, providing evidence that led to indictments against dozens of officials who had participated in his father's schemes. Augustus Thornfield himself was arrested at his main estate while attempting to flee to Canada, his empire reduced to legal documents and his freedom measured in the years he would spend in federal prison. The man who had once commanded respect through fear now faced the justice system he had corrupted. defended by lawyers who could not overcome the weight of evidence against him. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with newspapers across the country covering every detail of the corporate conspiracy that had been exposed by a son's confession. Marcus's testimony was devastating, delivered with the calm precision of someone who had finally found the courage to tell the truth about everything he had witnessed. "My father taught me that power justified itself," Marcus told the packed courtroom during his 3 days on the witness stand. "He taught me that success was measured by the ability to impose your will on others, regardless of the human cost. I learned in the Richland Valley that he was wrong about everything that mattered." The conviction was inevitable, but the sentence was harsher than anyone had expected. Augustus Thornfield was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, his assets seized to compensate the victims of his schemes, his name permanently associated with the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed American democracy. But Marcus's real redemption came not in the courtroom, but in the fields of the Richland Valley, where he had chosen to make his permanent home. The farming community had voted to accept his offer to purchase a small tract of land, not because they had forgiven his original deception, but because they had seen how completely he had transformed himself. The work was hard and honest, requiring skills that no engineering degree could provide. Marcus learned to read the weather, to understand the needs of crops and livestock, to find satisfaction in the daily rhythms of agricultural life. His hands developed the calluses of a working man. His body acquired the strength that came from physical labor. His mind found peace in the simple complexity of making things grow. Charlotte had been watching his transformation with the careful attention of someone who understood that true change was measured not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet consistency of daily choices. She had not forgotten his deception, but she had learned to value the man he had become more than the man he had been. "You've changed," she told him one evening as they walked through the fields that had become his life's work. "You've become someone I can respect." "I've become someone I can live with," Marcus replied, understanding that self-respect was the foundation of all other relationships. "I've learned to value what I can build rather than what I can inherit." The proposal came during harvest season, delivered not with roses and romantic speeches, but with the practical honesty that had become the foundation of their relationship. Marcus had learned that Charlotte valued substance over style, commitment over passion, the promise of partnership over the illusion of romance. "I want to spend my life working beside you," he said simply. "I want to build something together that will last longer than either of us." Charlotte's answer was characteristic of her practical nature. "Then we'd better get to work." The wedding was held in the same church where the farming community had gathered to plan their resistance, witnessed by people who had learned to measure worth by actions rather than words. Heinrich Müller gave his blessing to a union that represented not just the joining of two people, but the triumph of principles over profit. Marcus Thornfield had finally found his place in the world, not through inheritance or manipulation, but through the patient work of earning respect one day at a time. The railroad empire that had defined his childhood was gone, but in its place he had discovered something more valuable: the satisfaction of a life lived in service to values greater than personal gain. The Richland Valley prospered under the leadership of people who understood that true wealth was measured not in stock prices, but in the strength of communities, the fertility of soil, and the bonds between neighbors who had learned to depend on each other. The railroad tracks that had once threatened to divide the valley were eventually built by a cooperative owned by the farmers themselves, serving their needs rather than exploiting their labor. Years later, when visitors came to learn about the community that had defeated one of the most powerful corporations in America, they would find Marcus Thornfield working in his fields, his expensive clothes replaced by overalls, his manicured hands calloused from honest labor. He had become what his father had never imagined possible, a man who measured success by the good he could do rather than the power he could wield. The transformation was complete, but the work would never end. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to choose integrity over convenience, community over profit, love over fear. Marcus had learned that redemption was not a destination, but a journey. Not a moment of forgiveness, but a lifetime of earning the right to be forgiven. And in the evening, when the work was done and the sun was setting over the prairie, he would walk home to Charlotte, knowing that he had finally become the kind of man who deserved her strength, her intelligence, and her love. The railroad tycoon's son had found his true inheritance, not in gold or stock certificates, but in the simple, profound satisfaction of a life well lived. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.